So Michael Cohen comes tomorrow. Where do you expect this to register on your wow-ometer?
That's a really hard one to tell. My wow-ometer has been somewhat recalibrated recently with everything that's been happening. I've been watching these developments, I guess, as intently as everybody else had. I'll certainly be watching it Wednesday. Of course, don't know what Mr. Cohen will say, but as investigators typically look at witnesses, he is a person who had extraordinary access to multiple people who are most likely of interest to the investigators of this matter, and so I think the possibilities are limitless.
If he ties the president to what he did with payments to women, how big a deal is that legally and in terms of what that might mean for our political process?
Well, it's hard for me to say how big of a deal that would be, for instance, to the work that the special counsel and his team are doing. But even putting that aside, I think it's enormously significant for a participant in those schemes to step forward and indicate that one of his cohorts, one of his co-conspirators, was the current president of the United States. That will be a remarkable thing to hear from a witness if that's in fact what we hear.
But people expect that already, and I wonder, you know about the DOJ guidance better than I ever will about why they don't believe in indicting a sitting president. But the Southern District could have been much more effusive than they were in their papers about the president and his role, individual one, as we suspect they were doing. Is there what could the government do with that? What could politicians do with that information?
Well, you can't say what politicians would do with it, but I think there are probably folks who believe that the evidence of the president's conduct is relevant in the minds of the men and women of this country. Whether or not the Justice Department decides to go forward and indict that conduct is a separate issue, and it's one that, as you've noted, constitutional scholars and folks at the Justice Department have for some time resolved by saying that a sitting president cannot be indicted. That's current policy.
Right.
But even considering that fact, assuming that to be true, it seems to me, as a citizen of this country, it's relevant to know whether or not the president engaged in conduct that would be considered evidence of a crime were he not the president of the United States.
What are your concerns about his credibility?
About Mr. Cohen's credibility?
Yes, sir.
He obviously has deep credibility issues. He's now admitted to lying to Congress. Those are all big hurdles for prosecutors and investigators to deal with as you're trying to put together a case. But I will say, Chris, that this is not unusual. We frequently conduct investigations and build cases and prosecutions on the basis of cooperators and witnesses who have credibility problems. There are ways to address those problems in court as long as the witness has admitted the misdeeds and the lies that he's stated prior to that fact and has taken some sort of responsibility and culpability for it. They can still provide testimony that is compelling and relevant to a prosecution. With
what you've heard from the Southern District, where they gave him like a qualified check, right? They said he was kind of helpful to us. He didn't want to give us other information that we wanted. The Mueller probe, more effusive in their praise for him, saying that, hey, he was credible and the information he gave us was helpful. How does that wash out for him?
Well, I think I think he clearly is getting credit from the Mueller folks for providing information that is directly relevant and of interest to them in their investigation. Maybe not so much so for the Southern District prosecutors who are looking maybe more broadly at Mr. Cohen's past activity and people he may have been involved in that have nothing to do with the ongoing Russia probe. So I think that explains the difference in the two reviews, as it were, by the prosecutors in their pre-sentence reports.
What would you want to hear most?
You know, as an investigator, that elusive element you are constantly trying to uncover is the element of intent. I think Mr. Cohen has been in a position to have heard conversations and seen actions taken and maybe be able to provide that sort of insider's view on what the intent of the folks at the center of this investigation truly was. That's been something that I think have not seen to date.
Mr. McCabe, while I have you, let me ask some questions I haven't heard fleshed out with you yet. Credibility is a problem for Cohen. Arguably, it's a problem for you as well. They found you at the FBI to be lacking candor. I know you don't like the basis for that judgment and a lot of other things in that IG's report that came out, but you know, he's an Obama appointee, and he came to those conclusions. There's a criminal reference to prosecute, to investigate, not to prosecute, to look at your matter. So what is your case for your own credibility?
Well, Chris, as you know, with civil litigation on its way and also with the current investigative efforts that are underway, I am limited in what I can really go into great detail with you tonight.
Right, but you know that people are going to watch, and if they're on the fence,
Yep.
a lot of our viewers are on the fence. And they're
Right.
like, well, this guy, the FBI says you lied. I mean, why would I believe him? What do you say to those people?
So what I'd say to those people, Chris, is a 21-year career in the FBI, absolutely unblemished career until the point at which the president decided and communicated to several people that he wanted me to go. What I can say about that IG report, which, as you noted, I deeply dispute, is that I never lied, never deliberately misled anyone, not in the IG's office, not in the FBI, and certainly never a director of the FBI under any circumstances at any time.
How do you explain that guy who's not a Trump guy, right? He was put in there by Obama, and you were there a long time. People respected you there. Him coming to a different conclusion.
I can't explain why the process seems to have been so greatly impacted by politics. We all know from the president's own statements his absolute, very clear intention, the result that he demanded from that investigation, and that's, of course, the one they delivered. I can't explain to you why, even now, as my team attempts to uncover the IG's own processes and policies and those rules that should guide a fair and impartial process, we've had to sue them in federal court to get access to information that, as I understand, they are obligated to provide to the public.
You think the IG did what they did with your findings because of the president?
I think the president had an indelible impact on the IG's process. I know that the process that I went through was one that was unfair, was one that left out multiple pieces of relevant information, the testimony of witnesses who were never even referenced in the report. I can't explain to you exactly why that happened, but I have great suspicion that the president's clear desire had an impact on it.
You know, it sounds to me like you're accusing the president of the same thing he accuses you, right? He says, McCabe had it out for me. He didn't like me. He opened up this investigation with no real basis. He had to hand it off. I got lucky there that he handed it off to Mueller because he was out to get me like a lot of other people there. You're making a similar case, Mr. McCabe, which is Trump was out to get you. So he persuaded an IG somehow, who's an Obama appointee, to say bad things about you.
Well, I don't think that's the case, Chris. I'm going to disagree with you there.
Please.
I think on the side of the decisions that I made and the decisions that we made in those fateful days in May, right after the firing of the director, we relied on our training, our authority, our processes. We had facts in our hands that indicated quite clearly that we had an articulable basis to believe that a crime may have been committed or that a threat to national security might exist.
So wait, explain that to my audience.
Sure.
Because that's a mouthful, and I get it. You know, I went to law school. Was never good enough to work for a place like the FBI. But the idea of, well, why did they start the investigation? Politically, the argument is they had nothing. They just didn't like him. You don't want to talk about specifics. I get it. But you just said a phrase there that I want you to explain to my audience in layman's terms. What did you feel that you knew that justified your decision?
Right. So, Chris, first thing you need to know is the FBI does not make decisions based on politics. We make our decisions based on facts. And by the time the director was fired, and then with the president's own comments of the fact that he was thinking about Russia when he fired the director, and the statements he made to the Russian foreign minister in the Oval Office about having relieved the pressure of the Russia investigation by firing the director, this all on the heels of his multiple comments to the director, the one particularly in which he asked us to stop investigating Mike Flynn, which we, of course, refused to do. When those circumstances culminated with the firing of the director and the statements of the president, at that point, we had the facts in our hands, clearly observable by anybody who's watching this, to be concerned that a federal crime, that of obstruction of justice, may be taking place, and that a threat to national security may have happened. That's the FBI standard for opening a case. When we are in that place where we have those facts in our hands, we are obligated to conduct an investigation. Doesn't mean that anybody did anything wrong. It doesn't mean we're convicting anybody of a crime or throwing them in jail. It's simply, we are the investigators. It's time for us to do our job, whether that's the President of the United States or anybody else.
Do you still believe that the president might be compromised by Russia or be some kind of asset?
I think that that is possible. That's why we opened the case. I think we turned those investigations over into the most capable hands they could possibly be in, and I await the results of that investigation, as does every other American.
Walk down this road with me just one more step, because I get the idea of, well, it looks like he's really messing with this, and then you guys would have an argument internally with your lawyers about whether or not a president can obstruct justice. I'm sure that was something that was a familiar conversation for you in making the decision that you guys ultimately made. But then, all right, so maybe he's somehow compromised. Based on what do you think that you can tell this audience gave you a suspicion that the president might be compromised by Russia?
Well, first, let me address the thing you just said there, Chris. We don't sit around in the FBI and discuss or make decisions about whether or not a president can commit a crime, whether or not a president can be indicted. Those are issues for the Department of Justice.